I think my primary set of conditions would be political conditions, and those would be conditions relating to having constituted the world's citizens as a democratic polity and having them judge that SRM is the way that they want to approach these kinds of problems. And I realize that that's a challenging political ambition. But nonetheless, I think that that is the right kind of approach that we ought to be taking. We, I think, feel quite strongly in democratic societies that we ought to behave democratically and that we ought to take decisions democratically. And it's one of the reasons, for example, that international treaties are ratified by national legislatures to ensure that they're not arbitrary actions taken by representatives of states without due consideration within the democratic process. And so I think that we should insist on similar kinds of commitments in the case of geoengineering. I happen to think that it's likely to be an extremely complicated problem because it's one that we haven't fully tried to tackle before. That is, if we imagine this decision about what kinds of SRM testing and deployment to pursue, especially if what we're talking about is large-scale testing and global-scale deployment, then that is a decision that will impact people all over the globe and therefore ought to be taken in a democratic fashion and be both legitimized by democratic deliberations and held accountable through democratic institutions. So I think that the fundamental ethical or normative challenges that we face associated with SRM governance have to do with empowering the people of the world to make a collective decision, which is sort of what I was talking about a few minutes ago. And that this is not at all straightforward. So we just heard two presentations from Kyle White and Petra Schakert about Native American tribes in the United States and about West African communities and their participation in these debates, laying out what I think are tremendously difficult challenges for the effective and empowered participation of these communities within global debates because they bring fundamentally different ways of looking at these problems and fundamentally different standards for evaluating the appropriateness of public action and fundamentally different histories of exploitation and impact from decisions taken by those outside their lands that have significantly impacted their ability to thrive. And undoing those differences, creating the kind of deliberative spaces and decision-making spaces that enable those alternative positions to be held equal, at least at the outset of a respectful debate. It will be an incredibly difficult challenge to solve. But at the end of the day, I think that it is a sort of principled commitment to equality, the kind that underpinned this country's constitutional moment at the end of the 18th century that said, whether it's realistic or not, we choose to articulate our political institutions around the idea that one person is one voice, and that equality demands that our institutions operate in certain kinds of ways and empower people in certain kinds of ways. Of course, we don't live in anything like that ideal scenario, but nonetheless, a commitment to that ideal has both created institutional protections and also given rise to empowered voices that push back against clear and obvious violations of those privileges that we have. And so I think that's where I would put the biggest sets of ethical challenges. I mean, there are obviously the preceding set of ethical challenges that have to do with the distribution of goods and risks associated with SRM deployment, and how those risks and benefits are distributed across the globe, and how that distribution and projected distributions impacts the decisions that we take is obviously an important set of ethical challenges. But I think if we don't get the sort of principle of equality right within decision making from the outset, that those ethical questions, that the set of distributional ethical questions will have no bite on the decisions that we might make. My own inclination at this point is to call for the creation of something like a World Commission on Geoengineering. So we've had a series of what have now come to be called World Commissions. Two of the most well-known are the World Commission on Environment and Development and the World Commission on Dams. And I think they provide an interesting model. For one, at the outset of the World Commission on Environment and Development, first of all, it's a broadly representative group of people who sit on these commissions. Representative both in terms of discipline and specialization, in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of geography, race, position, and power in the world, and so forth. There is this commitment at the outset that the members of the Commission are equal in terms of their ability to shape the deliberations of the Commission. The second thing that's good about it is that it starts from these commissions start from the proposition that one should listen to the people of the world. So the World Commission on Environment and Development took as its first action to hold a series of hearings around the globe, inviting a wide range of different people, differently situated people, to speak to those hearings. And I like that idea because I think it says the answer is not what we know, but rather what we need to listen to and who we need to listen to before we start to think about what we should do and what kinds of things we need to know before we should do. The World Commission on Dams is interesting precisely because it was a reaction to the imposition of large-scale technological systems in lots of places where people have historically been disempowered. And these were the large, these were the large dams that were being built on rivers all over the world. And a concern that those technologies had not led us in the direction that we necessarily wanted to go, both locally and globally. And I think one could make a pitch about, not necessarily geoengineering, but about a fossil fuel-based energy system. That likewise it is a system that, for a variety of reasons, we have imposed on large fractions of the world that has not gone in directions that necessarily we are comfortable with as a global community, and that geoengineering is a proposed response. But one in, well, it's a proposed response, one that doesn't necessarily get at the fundamental questions that have been raised about the fossil fuel-based economy and energy system. But nonetheless, I think geoengineering too would be the imposition of yet another large-scale technological system on much of the world. And so I think if we're going to do that, if we're going to tackle these problems, if we're going to create these global-scale technological systems, that this precedent of having a conversation about a global technological system and a global set of technologies is an interesting and useful precedent to put those technologies up front as technologies and to say we want to have a conversation about them. I think we need to be front and center about tackling the challenge of valuing outcomes. So let me give the simplest example. Climate adaptation is often talked about in terms of farmers. Farmers have a set of choices that they face with respect to changing climates. One is to change the apparatus of farming that they are engaged in, to change the crops, to change the way they manage the crops, to change the varieties that they use, to try to continue to farm much as they've farmed in the past. Farmers may also be in a position to radically change the way they farm. So they may decide to farm an entirely different crop that they've never farmed before. But farmers also have a choice to stop farming, to adopt other means of living and providing a livelihood in the world. And I think if you look at those three outcomes, marginal technological changes to try to continue to farm as one has always farmed, substantial changes in what one is doing to farm, to adapt, to create farming that's adapted to this new climatic set of conditions, or to simply alter one's means of acquiring a livelihood and stop farming. I don't think we have a good sense of how to approach the question of how we value those different outcomes. There are potentially very positive things about all three of those outcomes. There are potentially quite negative things about all three of those outcomes. And I don't think we have grappled yet in our technical analyses with this question of valuation of outcomes. And I think geoengineering poses exactly the same problem, because there will be outcomes for people of geoengineering, both experiments and deployments. And there will be outcomes of choosing not to experiment and not to deploy. And we don't have a clue how to value those diverse outcomes. But we shouldn't assume that we know which of those outcomes is the better outcomes or the more valued outcomes.